I'm Zach Parker, and I'm here with James Wright, author of the Agile Principles for Business. And we're going to discuss today a little bit about the book and just kind of get into some of the parts of the first chapter that were interesting. What we hope to do with this is just kind of insert this into the audio book itself, and we'll add this as an extra, like a bonus chapter for each of the chapters as we go. Just do a little bit of a discussion and kind of figure out what else can we put in here to provide value for the customers. So we'll kick things off. James, did you want to introduce yourself?
I'm James. Yeah, I'll give you the 20 seconds. My background is product management, and I work with software. Then got into hardware. Fell in love with manufacturing. Because everything comes together in manufacturing. You got the software, you got the hardware design, you got the supply chain. You got the high tech people, you got the low tech people on the production line, you got the low tech people in the shipping and receiving. It brings kind of everybody together. Just love it. And eventually I got into upper management, and then I got sick. I don't recommend that for everybody or anybody. And then I came back and had to change my career. So I found Agile and realized I've been Agile my whole life. I just didn't know what to call it. I wasn't doing Scrum per se, but when I ran engineering with 30 engineers, we had stand-ups, and we ran things in an Agile way, and it worked. So when I found Agile, I probably went from introduction to being a coach faster than anybody else, just because I had been coaching executives for years. And so, and I'd been Agile, so I was able to be a Scrum Master for about a year, and then I was coaching. And that was 10 years ago. So here we are.
Very nice. So let me ask you real quick, because I did see a post this morning on LinkedIn where someone was talking about, we use a lot of terminology that is very specific, a lot of jargon specific to Agile whenever we talk to people about Agile. And sometimes we just need to use like regular old words. So can you, in your best regular old words, can you tell me, like, what exactly do you mean by you were working in an Agile way? What kinds of things were you doing? What was the,
Sure.
How did that work?
So I would call it distributed accountability, right? If you can set your mission and objectives, know what you're trying to accomplish, share that with everybody in the organization, let everybody know how they contribute to that, and then work together to make it happen instead of top-down management, micromanagement, assignment kind of a situation. That's what I mean. From the time I was a 12-year-old, that's what I learned at church. That's what I learned in Boy Scouts. We had adult leaders, but the good adult leaders, they let us plan, right? We were accountable for having good activities. They were kind of the advisors, I guess is the best word. I suppose in Agile terminology, the Scoutmaster was really the scouting coach, helping the boys make the right choices and follow through. And in business, I found that people did better when they felt like they had a say and they were actually able to make choices. And that's nothing new. It's not like I invented that. It's just that's through trial and error, through how my father and my friends taught me. That's how it was. So whenever I could, I found people that wanted to be in that situation, and it worked really good. And when I was a coach for executives, one of the biggest things I kept saying over and over again was let go. Right? Set the course, equip the people with the tools they need, and let them go.
Very nice. That's interesting. So one of the things you said there at the beginning was the idea of distributed accountability. Did you want to talk more about that? I know you kind of go into that a little bit later on in the book, but maybe now would be a good time to kind of talk about what exactly do you mean by distributed accountability?
It means everybody has to have a stewardship, meaning something that they are responsible for, kind of like with some boundaries, so that they know what they're supposed to do with it, right? That way they can act for themselves without waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. And in a way that they know what everybody else's stewardship is, so they know how they should collaborate with each other. Now, the first chapter is all about D-Day. Everybody knew what their responsibilities were, right? The paratroopers are going in to prepare everything for the amphibious invasion. They knew why they were going in at night. They knew what their responsibilities were. They knew what their objectives were to try and conquer, to capture. The people on the boats know what their job was. They knew what the paratroopers' job was, right? And because of that, they could collaborate to make things happen. They could improvise when things went wrong. They didn't have to wait for somebody to tell them what to do. And that's really the thing that just surprised me as I read the story about D-Day was that that's the way organizations should be, right? They should give people their responsibilities. They should empower them to act for themselves, and they should let them go, right?
That's interesting because it's one of the I have a military background myself, and it's one of the examples that I use, or one of the, I guess, use cases that I use whenever I'm trying to explain to people um, why sort of top down, driven things don't tend to work very well in like an agile environment. As I say, the example is um, if the commanding officer had to go around and tell each soldier which bad guy to shoot and when to shoot them, you'd never be able to fight a war. They
Well,
have to give them some autonomy to figure
they
out what
did
to do.
they did that back in the 16th and 17th century,
Yeah.
right? They marched in lines, and the commander said, "Shoot that way."
Yep.
And then this thing called the Civil War came around, where guerrilla warfare came out, and all of a sudden that did not work at all anymore. Everywhere around the world started saying, "Why should we stand in lines? You know, I'm going to stand behind a tree, right? I'm going to get behind a rock." And then everything changed,
Yeah.
right? So um, now I'm not saying that standing in lines was the right thing to do. I'm not a military historian, um, but you can see how in the modern era, how that top-down command and control doesn't work. They still use that terminology, right? Command and control.
Hmm.
It doesn't work. Now, really quick on that topic, I was at a coaching um, retreat, a bunch of agile coaches. This was like 2015, and I met a man who was a coach at Walmart, and he was saying how he wished he had, some real world anecdotes he could use to help in his training of his teams. And I said, "Well, what were you before you were an agile coach?" He says, "Well, I was in the military." So what did you do? He says, "I was in special operations." And I said, "Oh, come on, you got stories to tell." He says, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Okay, when you were dropped out of a helicopter into a location, did your boss tell you what to do from then on?" He goes, "No, no, we had our objectives defined, way back when we planned them out, and when we got in the field, then we had to kind of, improvise based upon what we saw." I said, "That's agile." He goes, "Oh, yeah, you're right. You planned, and then you do, right? You come back, you have your action after action report, you report back. There's nothing more. There's nothing more agile about planning and then doing and then reporting, right? That's stewardship. That is accountability.
Yeah. Yep. That's awesome. Um, there's a lot of stuff I think from the military that can be applied in Agile. So I'm curious, why did you choose World War II for the first chapter? What was the impetus behind that?
Well, I feel like it kind of chose me. I wrote my first book in 2014, just after I'd been in Agile for a year. And I wrote that one as just like a booklet, as a warning to business people saying, don't be duped by people who aren't Agile that are sharing things. Like I saw one book out there, it had the title Agile and it had the word marketing in it. And I read the book, and all it was traditional waterfall with new terminology in there. Total command and control, micromanagement stuff. And so I wrote my little booklet, and I tried to price it so that everybody could afford it, or not think about buying it. I think the Kindle was $1.99. And the whole point of the book was, this is what Agile really is. So, it wasn't much. Then I thought, well, I should really write, after I was training people and doing seminars and workshops and things, I thought I should really put, effort into a real book. And so I started organizing my stuff and, putting together my list of 12 principles and so forth. And at the time I was working out in the gym every day and listening to audiobooks. I like listening to audiobooks since around 2005. I've been doing it. And at the time, also into history. And while I was working at the beginning of organizing my book, I was reading about, the airborne invasion, that book. And as I was listening to it, I said, wow, that's interesting. And then, that kind of fits with what I'm talking about. And pretty soon I was stopping every 3 minutes, hitting the bookmark button on my phone, and realized this is a perfect case study. I mean, I didn't go looking for it. It was just there. And so I don't know if that's coincidence or serendipity or whatever, but that's how I found it, just by chance.
That's awesome. I to get slightly off track, there's a when I was studying the Bible a little bit, I kind of got into some of the Jewish teachings about the Old Testament, and they talked about how if a concept doesn't exist in Hebrew, then it's not an eternal principle. It's not something that actually exists. And so, like, one of the things that doesn't exist as a word in Hebrew is vacation. Another one is retirement. So those things
Yeah,
don't
I've
actually
heard the
exist.
retirement one before.
But then, what was the now? What was the where was I going with that?
How principles are there when you discover them?
Yeah,
Is that where you're going?
there was something that you just said that oh
Well,
shoot, I can't remember.
the reason, yeah. So I was saying that because I had the principles on my mind, that's how I recognized that the D-Day invasion was what it was.
Oh, I know what it was. It was the serendipity comment,
Okay.
right? There's no such thing as coincidence in Hebrew. So it's all part of God's plan, right?
Well, that's why everybody should buy the book, because that's part of God's plan.
That's right. All right, so that's pretty cool. Um, I like how things that we listen to, because I do a lot of reading too. I like how things that we listen to tend to work really well. You find information in the books that you're reading now that go along with some of the things that you're thinking about and some of the ideas that you're playing around with for your work. So one of the questions that I was just thinking about, to go back a little bit in your comments, was the command and control and the project management stuff. So you said that command and control doesn't work, and we kind of talked a little bit about some examples of where that might not work very well. But why do you think, as a general rule, a command and control type environment doesn't work so well, like in software or really any place where you have teams that are trying to accomplish something novel?
Well, it's quite a paradox, right? Because when you're studying D-Day, the lament was always, wow, if our communications were just better, things would be a whole lot easier. Well, the communications got a lot better, and it's not like the military got more agile. And in business today, communication technology allows, if the CEO wanted to know what any individual wanted to do, he could just jump in there and tell her what to do. So why is it not better? Because not everybody has every talent, right? And the people closer to the problem are typically better at solving the problem than people far away, right? So the analogy I use in the book, not to ruin the future chapter, is you don't want the CEO of the airline telling the pilot how to fly the plane. You want the pilot to do it. You want the rest of the company to enable the pilot to have a plane that works, fuel in there, all the resources necessary, but you want the pilot to make the choices. And in the case of business, the reason why you hire people is because you want their talents. Well, if you tell that person exactly what to do, you're negating that benefit, that value. In the old days, we used to say, you don't want your boss bending over a software programmer's shoulder and saying, put a comma right there. You don't want him, leaning over an artist and saying, ooh, change that color to blue, right? You hire an artist for the artwork. You hire a programmer for the program. You hire an accountant for their ability to work with the finance. Why would you take all that away just so you can control people what they do? And I think in my book I say no company's ever failed where the people say, well, if we were just micromanaged a little bit more, it all would have worked out. If they took away our freedom, then maybe we would have done better. If we stopped listening to the customer and listened to my manager, we would have known what to do, right? That doesn't happen very much or at all.
Customers don't know what they want.
Well, I also tell a story about how I was at one company, and I came back and I was, the head of marketing. I was telling them we needed to redesign the product to meet what the customers are really saying they want. And at that particular company, when I got there, the sales were horrible. And they were always wondering, why won't people buy our stuff? Why won't people buy our stuff? And I said, well, here's what we need to do to fix it. And the founder of the company was still running engineering. He says, well, that's not what we should do. And I said, well, that's what the customers want. And he goes, well, the customers are wrong. And I said, well, I'm not sure if I remember how business works, but if the customer doesn't like it, they don't give us money, right? We can't put right and wrong on the balance sheet. Let's give them what they need. Let's give them what they want. And strangely enough, I got them to do it, and then we started selling stuff.
Nice. Yeah, the customers are the ones that have all the money, right? They're the ones who are going to decide whether your product lives or dies.
Well, I got a little bit of argument. I said, look, didn't you hire me because I knew what the market was doing? Well, here I am telling you what the market needs. I'm not going to tell you how to write the code. Please let me do my part. I'll let you do your part. We'll be successful together.
Awesome. All right. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here. I want to go back and ask you like a primary question. I think that you wanted to address, and I know that a lot of people out there are going to want to know the answer to, which is, why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote it for two reasons. The first reason was my fear was that Agile was getting stuck in the software departments and companies and not spreading out to the rest of it. And so this was really like a missionary track to say it should be everywhere. The second reason I wrote it was because most of the Agile stuff out there today is so bogged down in the procedural policies that it doesn't really describe why things work or how to modify it for someone's particular needs, right? So if you go to an Agile conference today, they'll be talking about TDD. They'll be talking about all kinds of software stuff, all kinds of testing issues. They'll be talking about um, the best way to use t-shirt sizes and estimating large projects. They'll be getting into detail about how we should be product-based, not project-based. Well, that's all fine. But if someone that's running a $3 billion company showed up to one of those Agile events, they'd walk away saying, well, how does that work for me running my whole business? And I wanted to have a way for people to know how to do that and understand what the core reasons why Agile works, and that would give them the chance to implement it everywhere else. So a lot of the book, I think it would be considered heretical to most Agile people out there, because well, in chapter 3, I think it is, I come out and say the Agile Manifesto is wrong. You know, the principles they list aren't principles, they're policies. I do that for most of the big lists out there. You know, I guess one of the big things, if you were to ask I mean, I have a lot of respect for the people that were the pioneers, but if you were to go to Sutherland and say, what's the best way to measure success? His response is going to be working code, right? I mean, I think I've heard him say that and write that like 20 times without even trying. He's probably said that hundreds of times in his life. Well, respectfully, you're wrong, right? It's not working code. It's working code in a software environment that people want to pay for, that
Right.
helps their lives. It's not just working code. It's a product that works, that delivers value, right? Now, they're changing a lot of the terminology. I know SAFe just changed to talk about value streams, but you know, underneath there, it's really talking about finishing hunks of work. Well, that's a lot of what Agile's about, but really Agile's more than that. It's about doing the right thing, not just finishing stuff and doing stuff, but doing the right stuff. I mean, I know I'd rather do 2 or 3 things that people really like than doing 100 things that people don't like. I think most people would feel the same way.
So how do we get people to focus on doing the right things versus just doing things? Because I know a lot of places right now are kind of engaged in this game where they just say we need to get stuff done, and they go about just tasking the teams with as much work as they can possibly cram into a 2-week period. Or
Well, we really need to get to the core of the principle that I list called outcome over output. It doesn't matter how much work you do. It matters if you do the right thing, the right result. And I think more than anything else that comes through with the story of D-Day, right? It didn't matter how many soldiers they put on the beach. It didn't matter how many went in the airplanes. It didn't matter how many days it took to get things done. It just mattered, did they win or did they lose? I mean, that was understood by everybody. If we lose, you know, the next 50 years of world history is going to suck. If we don't succeed, then a lot of people are going to die. That's a result. That's a real world result. I know, you know, my father was there, and he wasn't on the shore, but he was in England, and came over the channel shortly after the invasion. He was working with computers. And I remember back in the late 90s, was it, when Saving Private Ryan came out? I said, hey, Dad, why don't we go to that movie? I hear it's very realistic. And my dad said, well, if it's realistic, I want to stay away from it. He remembered how horrible that situation was, and he remembered the friends that he lost, and how horrible war was, right? The whole point was to get it over with, to win. To bring liberty back. And those were amazingly high stakes and incredibly important outcomes that need to be created. You know, if it was just down to how many square feet were captured, or some kind of performance measure of, you know, bullets per soldier shot, all kinds of KPIs that were being taken care of, you know, looking at, It didn't matter. It mattered is, did they win or did they lose? And in business, I see a whole lot of that. And they care about KPIs that may or may not really matter. They care about pushing projects off their desk, finishing things. They don't really seem, a lot of people don't really seem to care about if those things were effective or not. They get their compensation is based upon how they perform personally, based upon the stuff that's assigned to them, not on, did the company do well or not. The more you get away from outcome-based planning, outcome-based performance evaluation, the more you get into the possibility of just doing the wrong thing, right? I have a lot of examples in the book of companies that said they did everything right and then they went out of business. Well, then they didn't do everything right. They might have been following their policies. They might have been, finishing a lot of stuff. They're just doing the wrong stuff.
Yeah. So being able to get things in front of customers that they actually want to purchase is a critical part of the business cycle. It's probably the most critical part of the business cycle.
Yeah. So the book is based on, well, it's semi-autobiographic. That's the word. It's based on a few things. My experience with working with companies I really admired, things I learned from people that taught me this important stuff. There are a few recurring themes like air traffic safety and a lot of analogies and a lot of little, yes. If you see a topic up front, you're probably going to see it again later in the book. But one of those things was the amazing example of Matsushita, right? The huge electronics company from Japan. They started out with just 100 yen, right? That's 30 cents back in 1917. He was probably the most successful entrepreneur ever. One time, he had a division that was doing poorly, and the man that ran the division came to him and said, "Can the corporate, parent give us a loan so that we can, get by with our current problems?" And Matsushita said, "You aren't using your resources properly. That's a sin against the company and against our nation, right? We have limited resources, and if you're not using them well, then we should give those resources to somebody else who can use them well."
Ooh.
Right? Well, that's a whole lot deeper cut than just saying you're not doing your job very well, right? And I would suggest that maybe that's the right way to look at it.
Yeah.
When we're in a company, we're there to make money for our shareholders. But we're there to serve our customer. We're there to serve, society as a whole. If you're there just to make money, then that's not, people might say that's capitalism, but that is capitalism without a conscience. And I think Adam Smith would be upset with you, right? You should be there to serve your customers and your employees and society as a whole. And that means taking a little bit of resources and turning it into something worth a whole lot more.
Yeah.
Through organization, through, the work of your mind. And so what Matsushita said to this man was, "I'll take you to the bank. I'll introduce you to the banker. And if he decides he doesn't want to give you a loan, then we're just going to shut you down." Well, the guy got the loan, and then Matsushita said to him, "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to pull everybody in. You're going to talk about the problem with your entire organization. You're not going to do it by yourself. You're going to find a solution. You're going to reorganize. You're going to find out the way to make your customers happy, or I'm just going to get rid of the whole thing." I mean, that is leadership, right? He didn't just say, "Get your numbers better or you're out." He explained the context of the problem. He gave the suggestion on how to solve it, but he didn't do it for him. He didn't come
Yeah.
in and say, I'm going to make these changes. I'm going to get rid of this vice president. I'm going to move this group over here. I'm going to restructure your capital. He said, you do it. It's your stewardship. You take care of it. Include everybody, right? He's basically saying, I'm giving your stewardship. Make sure they have theirs. And it worked
Wow.
out. And later, like 10 years later, that man said, that was the most important event of my life. It turned me around. Now all these people, now we have more people working for us. Now we're taking care of more customers, taking more employees, right? And that's the example that's capitalism, taking resources, making it worth more, helping out
Yeah.
the customers, helping out the employees as you go.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people miss. I was just talking to somebody else about this similar conversation the other day. Is that if all you do is pursue the money, eventually you might make some money in the short term, but eventually people will see through the fact that you're just in it for the money, and they're gonna stop buying whatever your product is because it's not gonna deliver value to them in a way that causes them to say, yeah, I'm getting more than what I think I'm paying for.
Well, if all you do is pursue money, it doesn't give you much guidance on what to do.
Right.
In fact, I think I mentioned in the book that I've known a lot of companies where if they want to maximize shareholder value, they should just lock the doors, sell off the assets, stop doing anything.
That's a pretty intense. That's a pretty intense story about Matsushita.
Yeah,
Matsushita.
yeah. The Japanese language is very easy to pronounce, and there are about 3 or 4 examples of where it's not. That that's one of them.
That's intense. Um, so
There's another story of his I love
okay.
that is a really good example of agility. During the Depression, his sales were down. And everybody was just laying off factory workers, right? You don't need people working the factory if you're not making sales. Well, Matsushita did not want to lay off his people. So he told his factory workers, if you don't have anything to do in the factory, then pick up your bag and go on the street and sell. And
Hmm.
during the Depression, they didn't lay off anybody because
Wow.
they had more that turned into more salespeople on the street. They were able to sell more. It brought work into the factories.
Wow.
I mean,
That's a
you
that's
hear
a
a
great
lot of
example
stories.
of taking care of your people too.
You hear a lot of stories about job training, and and when people get laid off, we'll help you learn something else. But he said, no, we're going to keep you. We're going to help let you do something else.
That's awesome.
And how many companies do you know that would go to a person that does assembly work and say, we're going to make you a field salesperson? That doesn't happen very much.
I don't know any. So, who would you say? I know we can all probably, as agile people. I'm sure there'll be a lot of agile workers who buy the book and listen to the audio recording here. But who would you say is the primary audience for this book, and then who can benefit from it, other than folks who are just in the agile game?
Um, I want to sound too self-congratulatory, but I would say everybody. Um, I tried to write it in such a way, and focusing on the principles is the thing that allowed me to do that, that it would work for everybody. If you work at a nonprofit, it works there. If you work with a volunteer group, it works there. If you work with kids, it works there. If you work with adults, it works there. High tech, low tech, they're principles. We're going to talk about the principles. We're going to give you examples. You're going to find ways to apply them that I couldn't. They're real principles. I'm not teaching about the best way to have a retrospective at the end of 2 weeks. I mentioned with like maybe half a page, but the concept of gathering people together to learn from your mistakes and your successes, that where does that not work? All right. But if we just have a retrospective at the end of a sprint, then people might not know how that might apply to people that work in a daycare center. But if we teach about validated learning and collaboration, then they could find a way to, yeah, well, we can communicate more with each other. We can get together on a regular basis and find out the best way to deal with problems. You know, it's principles work everywhere there that you put them. That's the nice thing about having something that's real and true. They work everywhere.
So Operation Neptune was the is the first chapter here. Did you want to go through any of the examples that you gave in the book there and draw anything else out of them? Was there anything you felt like I talked about this a little bit in the book, but maybe the lesson didn't quite come across, or maybe there was something that you felt like was left out that you wanted to talk more about?
Well, the first draft of chapter 1 was 3 times as long. And I realized that people aren't buying the book to get history. They could go back and read the original books. I ended up taking content from about 6 or 7 books on it. The the two things I really wanted to pull out that I don't think I hit too hard. The first is that the leadership that was displayed in those few days had nothing to do with the backgrounds of the people or their rank or anything else that you might expect if you're the kind of person that cares about what a resume looks like or what an organizational structure is, right? Some of the greatest leaders were privates who had an idea of the best thing to do based upon what they saw. And there are examples of generals following privates, right? There are examples of sergeants leading officers. The officer said, "That's a good idea. You take it, run with it. We'll follow you." There are examples of people ending up in a spot because of circumstances they didn't expect, and then they held that spot and found out, well, that was the most strategic spot they could have been in, that nobody thought of in the planning process. They ran into things that they did not expect at all, like the fields were flooded. Well, you can't tell that. They didn't have satellite photos. They didn't have very good photos from airplanes flown over. They thought it was like 3 inches of water. It was like 8 feet of water. They had to deal with so much, and the only way they could do it was letting people on the ground make the decisions while they were there. All kinds of heroism stories. I wanted to really get a feel for it, but I couldn't. I started listing all the stories I wanted to tell, and there were just too many. Where if they had done what they were told to do, so many more would have died. But because they changed the mind and said, "I'm not going to follow the instructions they gave me. I'm going to make this choice based upon I want to save that guy over there, right? If I do this, maybe these other people won't die." Just all kinds of really cool stories about that, where it was because they had the freedom to act independently on what they saw and what they believed. They were able to do some really cool things. So that was the first part, right? The second thing I wanted to really have people get a feel for was just the courage of Eisenhower himself. If it wasn't for him, the whole thing would have fallen apart. And I never understood that until I did the research for this book. I always thought he was a good leader and a good military mind and so forth, but he did just a few things that made the big difference. And that's the kind of leaders we need in business, we need in government. Not someone that makes all the detailed decisions, what to happen in the field, but the big decisions like combining all the nations, all the allies together into one organization, right? Telling people that had been in the military longer than he had, or had higher rank longer than he had, you report to me, right? I don't know if I really emphasized it enough, but when the war started in 1839, Eisenhower was lieutenant colonel, and his background was infantry and tanks, but he got into just an administrative stuff. He didn't have expertise in these things. He didn't need to be an expert. He just needed to be a leader, right? Gather the information together and make the decisions, right? Trust and create this group of leadership that could work together, right? The French didn't want to work with the English or with the Americans, right? There's all kinds of bitterness and animosity. And, when the Americans showed up, I'm sure they were saying, we've been fighting for 3 years. Where have you been? But he just cut through all that and says the only way we can win is if we do this together. And here we are. And he took people and he kind of leveled out the management. So, an air marshal is a really big deal. And he says, okay, but you're on my staff, right? You report to me now. And that created just a new way of doing things. Perhaps my favorite story is when, I like Churchill a lot, but he's not a perfect man. And
none of us are.
And at one point, he had a little bit of an ego. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but at one point, he wanted to get on a ship and go to the front lines. And Eisenhower freaked out about it. Right? Well, I can't have a prime minister on a ship because if he dies, that'll be all kinds of stability issues. So I'm gonna have to make sure that ship is protected, and I can't stop him because it's an English ship, and the prime minister doesn't report to me. And he had a lot of problems trying to figure out, well, how this is going to mess with everything. And then he was worried about, well, I can't talk to the people in the front lines. And if Churchill is there, well, Churchill used to be in the First World War, he was the minister of the Navy, right? And so he might just take over and start telling people to do things and messing everything up on the front lines. So he didn't know what to do. And he had I can't remember the detail, but he was sick over it. Well, the King of England stepped forward and made sure that didn't happen. He backed Eisenhower over his own man, Churchill, right? Those little things made big differences.
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect the king to do that, but he did.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an interesting story. I really enjoyed reading that in the book. I think a lot of the things that you talk about in there are very interesting pieces of World War II was a massive, massive engagement. It's mind-boggling. When they say world war, it literally was a world war. There's so many things going on all over the world. And it's tough sometimes because we kind of get this little bit of a snippet of it whenever we're in grade school and in high school and all that. If you go to college and you take history classes, you get a little bit of it too. But there's so much that happened. And I know this was the longest chapter, I think, in the book. A lot of information packed in there, but all the examples I thought were wonderful examples of how the Allies were effectively using principles of Agile, even though they didn't call it that, to prosecute the war in a very effective way. And I liked how you contrasted that against the Germans and the way that the Germans were more of a control and command, or a command and control organization. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So the beginning of the war, the Blitzkrieg was fast, right? And micromanagement can work if the person at the top is good, the communication lines are good, and the plan is just right. I mean, I've been in situations where I've seen people, be amazingly productive in very anti-agile activities. But when the Allies turned around and got their act together, they were much faster than Germans had been with Blitzkrieg. Nobody would have expected that. The Germans didn't expect that. And I think that's a great analogy for business today, right? People that have been doing, direct management approaches their entire career are going to say, well, it works. I tell somebody to do something, they do it, make sure it happens, it gets done. I put together my own little list. I don't need to share with anybody. If I leave people outside, that I could just boom, boom, get through my stuff and get it done. Those are the companies that are going to die by an agile company just rolling over them the way that the Allies did, right? There's a better way to do it, especially in an environment that is unpredictable, right? Maybe the reason why Blitzkrieg worked so well is because nobody was ready for war, right? And maybe the reason why Agile worked so great for the Allies is because it was a fluid environment with all kinds of surprises, and agility allowed them to deal with it, right? I didn't get into it in much detail, but the market garden offensive in the Netherlands was a huge blunder. And it was also a departure from the Agile way of doing things, right? The English said, this is what we want to do. This is how we want to do it. And they wanted to do something differently than the strategy that Eisenhower put down. And they used some obfuscation to not communicate back and keep it a secret what they were doing. Very anti-Agile behaviors. And it was a total disaster.
Yeah, it's surprising sometimes how critical the communication piece is to anything you're doing, but especially if you're engaged in warfare. People sometimes may not realize how critical that is to having effective, transparent communications amongst the side that you are on. Obviously, you don't want to expose your critical communications to your enemy, but
I think I have it in the book where the head of the Dutch underground, a man who lived in Holland his whole life, knew the ins and the outs, knew where the tunnels were, knew where the good guys were, knew where the bad guys were. He went to the British leadership and said, I can help you with your invasion plans. And they said, no, we know better than you do. But, that's it sounds silly, but that happens in business all the time.
Yeah.
People get together, put together a project plan or a sales strategy, and they'll leave out the people who know the details. Now, I'm not saying that a senior vice president should, do everything that a junior salesperson says they should do, but you should listen. There might be a little tidbit of information that can be used, right? When is more information bad?
It's not. A lot of interesting things there. I had a question in my head, and now I can't remember what it was. I should have written it down, but I didn't. So we'll move on. So what we already kind of talked around this subject, I think, a little bit, but what lessons would you expect or hope that the audience would draw about Agile from some of the stories that you presented in chapter 1 about Operation Neptune?
Well, let's go to the really basic stuff. For most people, operating in an Agile way is unnatural, right?
But it seems natural.
Well, it does, but the way that society and business in particular are organized, people have been getting compensated for their entire life for output, right? For finishing to-do lists or behaving a way the company asked them to, for conforming, right? Big successes happen when you don't conform. They in school, right? The students that master a topic quickly in most schools, they are asked to go at the same speed as everybody else, right? Very few options for kids to, do independent study or to experiment. Um, now I had some really good teachers, but um, to I'm not saying that they were perfect. That's far from the case. Even the really good ones were restricted from the schools on what they could and couldn't do.
Mhm.
Right? The whole idea of trying something different, usually it was stick to the lesson plan. And so you go through school with you must conform to the policies. And you go through work and you need to prove that you're worth it by doing these particular things. Um, and people have leaders that don't really care about them so much. They care about their own stuff. And so um, it turns out that most people have just been conditioned not to be agile.
Mhm.
So you can't really blame them for feeling that way or for
It's a
acting that way.
very it's a very context specific thing though, right? It's like you're not you're conditioned to not be agile primarily at the workplace, but in the rest of your life, typically the things that you're doing in the rest of your life are you're making decisions that are based on agile principles. Like,
Well, you say that because you tend to be agile yourself, but um, I have to say from my experience of being in the world all these years that the biggest mistakes I have made are mistakes where I've broken those principles. Like in
that's
my
true.
marriage, it's when I didn't open up to my wife,
Mm.
or when I made assumptions about what's going on without talking to her. Okay. Um, Situations where I try to do things on my own out of my ego instead of collaborating. Okay. Um, Even if we try to be agile, again, we're using agile as if it's the fix all panacea word. It's just a collaboration of, a combination of a lot of principles. And if any reader has a better word than agile, I would like to use it. Um, but a lot of people, they just aren't built that way,
Mhm.
right? If, for example, in the book, I talk about this concept called the Enos progression, right? Where at the core, you do things because you're told to do them. And um, most people don't even have that, right? They don't want to do what they're supposed to do. They rebel. They
Mhm.
have a great difficulty even getting to level one on that board. And the reason why it might work in the office is because um, you're compensated to do what the boss asks you to do. Even still, I've been at companies where, boy, they rebel and try to submarine decisions they don't like. Um, Agile requires people to embrace change. Most people just really don't like change because it makes them feel unstable.
Yeah.
And even I would say I'm at the extreme end of the liking change scale. I love change. If every day was the same, I'd get so bored. And yet there have been a few changes in my life I just didn't like, and I kind of rebelled like a teenager. Maybe not overtly, but in my attitude. Um, so even though I'm at the far end of that bell curve, I still had some difficulties on that topic. Um, we just have to deal with people being imperfect. And the other thing I would say on this topic is that when people feel threatened, they revert back, I think, to their core kind of essence as kind of like as they were as a child.
Mhm.
Um, so that if you're kind of a jerk, when you're under a lot of stress, you're going to be a jerk to people. And if you're the kind of person that doesn't want to share, boy, if business is getting tough, you are not going to share with anybody, right? If you're the kind of person that likes to tell rumors and talk behind people's back, well, you might behave really nice, but when the pressure comes on, you're going to start, telling all kind of things you shouldn't be talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just human nature. Well, it's not one of the principles I list in the book, but one of the principles that has to be part of Agile is, forgiveness and the ability to work with people that aren't perfect, because we all are imperfect.
Right. Yeah, that's very well said. So we kind of approach the subject here, but I'm going to go ahead and ask the question. What are some of the most common reasons why Agile fails? Where can we apply it? Like, what are the situations in which we can probably use Agile to be successful, and why does it fail?
Well, there are three big reasons why it fails. Reason number one, lack of leadership. If you don't have leadership at the top, making a full commitment, then the people below aren't going to follow. I mean, they aren't going to do it. I've been a coach at many companies where top leadership basically says, "This is for you; it's not for us." Well,
Yeah,
then you don't. Then the accountability isn't activated, right? Without accountability, you really can't do Agile, no matter how else you try.
that was one of the best lessons I thought from chapter one, which was where you're talking about how the generals in the paratroopers were actually going through and doing the same training alongside the enlisted folks.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that the very first person out of the plane, that very first day, was a general. Right? It let everybody else know, hey, they really are committed to this thing. But if you're having that accountability can't be activated, you can't report on your stewardship if there's no one to report to, right? Second reason that things fail is, if you get so caught up in the practices and the policies and forget about the principles, then it's just a bunch of running around doing stuff. It's just a bunch of extra meetings or different words, different terms to do tall things. And you might get a little bit of productivity boost, but you're not going to get, a 10x change. That's why I always tell people when I'm coaching, if I ask you to do something and you ask me why we're going to do it, I don't have a good reason, then you don't have to do it. But if you don't know why you're doing something, you're not going to do it right. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
All right. The third reason why failure happens, and this is one that I learned through sad experience. It takes a lot of effort, because the fact that most people aren't Agile naturally, and because the fact that we are imperfect. There's always the temptation, even once everything's up and rolling and doing great, there's always the temptation to cut a corner or to make an excuse or to have an exception. And then it's easy to have that second exception, that third exception, that fourth exception. And it's always easy to say. I was at one group where I realized this organization isn't going to make it, because no matter what leadership is saying, they just don't believe it. Mm. And I told my client, I think I'm going to have to leave because this isn't going to work. And she said, you can't go. We're doing so good. We're making such big, leaps forward. You can't leave. And I said, look, I think that if there's any kind of crisis that pops up, your VP is just going to say, we don't have time for this anymore.
Right.
And she said, no, they're fully committed. It's really going to be great. And I said, look, I'm sorry. I based upon my experience, that's just going to happen. And I'm going to go off and help a group where I think the leadership is fully committed. Oh, she was so upset with me and, felt like I was abandoning her. And so I said, look, I'm going to stay on for a month to try and help you, go through a transition. And a week and a half later, I was on a call and with the leadership group in that organization. This is a big company. It's a $50 billion company. It was a a group that was in charge of like $10 billion of sales on an annual basis. And I was on the call, and the VP said almost my exact words, "We are kind of in a crisis right now, so we're going to put all this transformation stuff on hold." And I didn't have my video turned on. I kind of covered my mouth so I didn't make any laughing noises. And then I noticed that my contact there dumped me on the call within 5 seconds because she was so embarrassed. But those are the three things. You got to have your leadership involved, fully committed. You got to base things on the principles, not just on the practices. And you got to keep putting effort into it. Otherwise, it's going to revert back. Just like how, within 2 months of the invasion, things in D-Day started reverting back.
Mhm. Yeah, it reminds me of the last piece you were talking about there. As soon as you started talking about that, I thought, we've talked about this a little bit before, but the book Turn the Ship Around, whenever David Marquet was talking about the being in charge of the Santa Fe for the first time and being under that pressure to perform, or maybe this was during the evaluation period that he was going through, where he was under the pressure to perform, and the crew was about to make the wrong decision in his mind, and so he was like really wanting to jump in and tell them what they needed to do, but he held himself back, and they ultimately ended up making the right decision, but they went through it in an agile way, right?
Yeah, I remember very distinctly at times in my career where I thought, "Oh, my people are doing the wrong thing." And I thought, unless it's a catastrophe, I have to let them do it. And so in most cases, it wasn't going to be a huge catastrophe. So I just told them, "All right, do it." The whole time I was thinking, that's going to be a disaster. But my job is to help them to take my job, right?
Yeah.
It's not to get through the next 3 months. It's to make the company be so successful that if I move on, the company's doing well and somebody can fill my chair. But
Yeah.
sometimes it's really hard.
And you tend to get weird looks because I've said that in interviews before, when they ask me, well, kind of what's your philosophy on agile coaching? I said, well, my philosophy is I want to train everyone. I want to coach everyone up to the point where they don't need me to sit there and remind them about what they're doing anymore. Like work myself out of a job, basically. So
Mhm.
a year from now, I don't want you all to be dependent on me to remind you about all the things that you need to do. It should become part of the culture at the organization at a deep enough level that everyone is acting in that coaching fashion all the time, so that if this person forgets, these people over here will remember and remind.
Yeah, so the one thing I would say is I used to say, and I still do, that my goal is for people to forget that I was there. I want them to remember what they did. I want them to remember the success that they had.
Mhm.
If I do my job right, they'll remember I was around doing something. But they won't say, "And because of James, we're fantastically successful." I also wanted to get to a point within about 9 months to a year where I could run away. And the only thing I would say is, if you do your job right, you won't have to remind them about the small things, but you can't abandon them. They need somebody in there to be the conscience to help them do the right thing. Now, that can be somebody internal. It doesn't have to be an outside consultant coach. It could be a director. It could be a vice president. It could be like you need to have an agile champion of some sort to be the one that says, "No, we won't make an exception. No, we won't cut corners. We will continue to do things right. We will still use principles to make our decisions. We won't resort to, micromanagement. We'll let the people, we will delegate, we will honor their stewardship. And if you don't have that from someone that's in the organization, then you still have to have the Agile coach there, right? I would say that was my biggest mistake through my Agile career, is saying, hey, they're up and running and doing things great, I can exit. I've made that mistake twice. I'm gonna try to avoid ever doing that again.
Yeah. I think that goes back to the first piece you talked about, the leadership piece, which is, the Agile champion has got to be, in my mind, has got to be the person who's at the top of the organization. If they're not bought in, then it doesn't matter really who else. You might have some people that can influence.
Well, when I was running organizations, I didn't need an Agile coach, right? Because I was the Agile champion. The problem is that, if you look at every organizational leader in the country, how many are there? Like, I don't know, 500,000? How many are there in the world? How many of those people are ready to be a real Agile champion, a real internal coach? Maybe 1%. We're just not there yet. Back in 2014, I made a prediction. I said that by 2025, the majority of large, successful public companies would be Agile based, that they would be teaching it in a university as a prerequisite to be able to get hired. They would organize classes in an Agile way to get people feeling how to do things and act in that environment. And I was wrong. So I'm not a prophet. Right. Here we are, 2023, and I haven't met a sizable company that's that way. I mean, I've met companies that have lots of Agile coaches. I've seen companies that try to do it outside of just software development, but I wouldn't call them Agile. I would call them using an Agile coach to facilitate some of the activities that they do. Right.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a university yet where the professor acts as the product owner and has the course self organize on how to learn what they need to pass the class. Right. I think that's coming, but I think we're all going to have to jump in to make that happen. It's not going to happen without on its own. It's going to have to take a lot of energy to make those kind of changes occur.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think I've run out of questions to ask you about the first chapter here. Did you want to give any kind of a segue into the second chapter, maybe a little preview of what the reader might expect to read in the next chapter?
Well, I mentioned in the book, I tried to write the second chapter so it feels like the first chapter. Right. The second chapter is a case study in iOmega, and as far as I know, I'm the only one to write it. It's, how many case studies have there been about Apple? I can't even count them all. But this is the only one that I know of about iOmega. And I think I wrote it in such a way that people can see that the same kinds of things occurred there that occurred with the Operation Neptune. Right. A leader came in from somewhere else that didn't look like he was particularly qualified. Because he exuded the right kind of leadership, there was some huge success through a painful transformation. A huge success happened, and then the effort for staying transformed disappeared, and then the company fell apart and then died. All right. Now, you wouldn't say that the Allied military died, but one of the reasons why I included the Stanley McChrystal quotes from his book Team of Teams is that they had to rediscover all those lessons all over again in the early 2000s that were learned way back in 1943 and 1944. So all those ideas were lost, just like at iOmega. All those great transformation things that happened in 1994, 1995, 1996, 1997 started getting lost in 1998, 1999, 2000, and by 2000, it was gone.
Yeah. One more question just came to me that I think might be an interesting factoid for the listener here. you had mentioned, I think last week or the week before when we were talking, that your dad not only was in the military but worked with Grace Hopper, who's we used a lot of quotes from Grace Hopper throughout the book to introduce the various different chapters. Grace Hopper is a very interesting individual. Did you want to talk about that? What you learned about your father's connection to her?
Yeah, so I was taking a class at a junior college when I was in high school on computer programming, and we learned about Grace Hopper, and just very impressive woman. And I came home and I told my dad about it, and I said she just must have been so smart. And my dad said, "Oh, and she's funny too." I thought, wait, what? And he told me, yeah, he had worked with her on the COBOL project. And then about 3 years later, I saw Grace Hopper on the David Letterman show, and my dad was right. She's pretty funny. Uh, yeah, she was amazing, right? She did something everybody thought was impossible. And if it weren't for her, we wouldn't have software. All right. So anybody who's ever done any software programming, or anybody that's used any software, you got to thank Grace. And of
Yeah,
course, I always thought her name was funny too, right? Grace Hopper. I guess you have to have a good sense of humor if that's your name.
very nice. When you can take the
But
Grace Hopper from my hand.
on the one hand, we have Grace Hopper as the mother of all software, but then we have Alan Turing as the father of all hardware. And those two
Mhm.
people were contemporaries.
Yeah, which is a really interesting thing, right? Because
And they were both in England at the same time working on the war together.
it's one of those things that's a
Well, not in the same
coincidence,
room.
but yet not a coincidence
Mhm.
because it doesn't exist. All right. Well, thanks, James. I appreciate the discussion here, and I think we're going to look forward to chapter 2 and be a little bit of a discussion after that as well.
All right. Thanks.